Hello, good people watching YouTube. This is Paul with Ageless Images, here today to talk to you about the oldest camera that I have in my collection, and that camera is the Pentax S1a. This camera was introduced in 1962 as a low-cost alternative to the SV and was discontinued in 1968. Now, the differences between the S1a and the SV was that the S1a did not have a self-timer, and also the shutter speed dial registered only up to 1/500th of a second instead of the 1/1000th of a second on the SV. However, as I will show you, these limitations were easy to overcome. Now, the first thing I'd like to point out is that many mechanical cameras of this era came with a protective padded leather case. Now, this served a number of purposes. The most obvious one was to protect the camera from bumps and knocks that could otherwise damage the camera. See, these cameras were not just intended as products of their time, they were meant to be ageless for many generations to enjoy. And so people buying them expected to protect their investment so their camera would last them their lifetime and for the lives of generations to come. Another thing this case protected this camera from was rain and snow. These camera bodies did not have any kind of weather sealing, but as you can see, this case will provide a reasonable level of protection by having the top part overlap the bottom like this. Now, when shooting outdoors, a photographer could flip the top off like this, remove the lens cap, take their shot, put the lens cap back on, then flip it back up to protect their camera. The top half will always stay on securely and will never accidentally fall off, even if it's dangling like this, because of the design of this half circle clip that holds it on. Now you see, you'll need to turn the top part 180 degrees up and pull straight out like this in order to remove it. While shooting, many photographers would leave this bottom half on. This was an additional guard to protect the film against light leaks, especially if you are shooting with a high ISO film. It also protected the back from being accidentally opened while the film was being used. Now, before I go on, I'd like to point out the beauty in the design of this camera. The curves, the lines, even the font used on this camera, they're absolutely stunning. The camera itself, it's a piece of art. Now, this camera doesn't need any batteries, which has helped cameras like this to last a long time. Without batteries, there is no risk of leakage and no electronic components like capacitors to leak as well. Everything on this camera was meant to be serviced and repaired if needed. Now, you'll notice that there's no light meter and also no hot shoe. And that might turn some people away from a camera like this. However, I feel the lack of these things actually makes this camera more timeless. Now, in 1962, many photographers who might buy the S1a might already have had a light meter, maybe like this one. These light meters also did not require batteries, and it wouldn't make sense for a photographer to want a camera with a light meter if they already had one. Today, we can use our smartphones with a light meter application to gauge exposure. Another option was to use the Sunny 16 rule to estimate correct daylight exposure, which often worked well. Now, if you didn't already own a light meter and wanted one that was integrated with this camera, you could buy the Pentax clip-on exposure meter like this one. I have the instructions for it here. I'm going to open it up for you now so you can have a quick look. And of course, the way they advertised this product back in the 1960s was a photograph of somebody lighting a cigarette, and the only light was the light coming off the match, which obviously could only be done if you had a good light meter to measure the amount of light you needed to set up the exposure properly. So what you would do with this accessory is you would squeeze these buttons here and slide it over the top of the camera, making sure to align this shutter speed coupling pin properly. Now, this took a mercury battery, which I don't have because I don't think this light meter works anymore. And you would calibrate this light meter with a zero adjust screw, which would normally be here. Now it's missing, and that's why I think that this is broken. Your film speed would be adjusted on the side like this. So you see your ISOs would be there, and you would just move the white dot accordingly. And then you would just slide it on the camera just like this. Just line it up with the eyepiece, squeeze in the tabs, and just make sure to align that pin. And then push down. And then, now, as you can see, there are two scales here. There's a low scale and a high scale. And that scale would move as you turned your shutter speed. So obviously the low scale was for lower shutter speeds. And then as you got faster, you would switch scales. And this scale would show you the various f-stops that you would use, and you would just use the one wherever the needle was pointed at. Pretty simple and pretty effective. Now, you might notice that there are two PC connectors here at the front of the camera, and these are for connecting a flash. The reason why there's two of them is because this camera could be used with either flash bulb technology or with modern strobe flash technology. Now, although most photographers used flash bulbs in 1962, this is very forward-thinking of Pentax to also include a strobe flash PC connector. Now, the reason why there are two connectors is because the timing for firing the flash is different for each type of flash. You will see that the shutter sync on this camera is actually 1/45th of a second. And so to accurately expose the picture, the timing for firing the flash had to be very precise. And since the strobe flashes have a different time to fire than bulb flashes, they included a connector for each. There was no hot shoe because most flashes were off camera, and photographers would use a handle, maybe like this one, to mount their flash on their camera. So you see there's a shoe there for a flash, and then you could actually just mount this right onto the bottom of the camera using a tripod mount, like so. And then you could just use a standard bulb flash like this one. And that would mount on there like that. And then you'd simply connect the cord there, like so. Now, of course, the problem with a handle like this is it would make your nice compact SLR a lot bigger and bulkier than it needed to be. And so, for those so inclined, Pentax did make available a shoe connector. Now, this one over the top, similar to the light meter, except there's no pins. It just slides over the eyepiece like that. And then you could take your flash, either bulb or strobe, mount it like so. You just run the cord down the side like this, connect it to the FP connector, and then now you can mount your flash right on top of your camera. Of course, this meant that you couldn't use a light meter, but you wouldn't want that with flash photography anyway. Bulb flash units like this one had a guide on the back. And when you bought your flash bulbs, you would set your guide number like this according to your film speed. Often, these flash bulb packages had a table, like this one, that you could use to find your film speed and adjust your aperture accordingly. If you wanted a brighter flash, you would buy bigger flash bulbs. It was as simple as that. This 12 pack of flash bulbs was bought from Wilco for $1.46 for 12 flash bulbs. Now, while that seems pretty cheap by today's standards, we need to remember that with inflation, this would cost us nearly $12 in the year 2020. So that's like almost a buck a bulb. And each bulb could only be used once. They look like this. Photography could get very expensive back then. We're pretty lucky today that we can use this camera with modern flash technology. Now, you probably noticed that this isn't actually a hot shoe, and the metal construction wouldn't really work well with a modern flash, so you would need to add something between your modern flash in this shoe so that it would work properly, and then you would use flashes that would have a PC connection cord, which in the day, and even to a certain degree today, most of them do. Now, the lenses are an M42 screw mount, and this camera came with a 55mm f2 prime lens. The M means metric, and 42 is the diagonal measurement in millimeters. It was common for cameras to ship with a prime lens like this, and this was one of the really good quality ones considering that this is a low-end camera. If you bought another lens, such as this 35mm prime lens, to get a wider field of view, you would get it in a padded case like this because, like the camera, these lenses were meant to last for many generations. Now, you might notice that these older lenses have a button that switches between automatic and manual. On this 55mm one, you see it says A and M. What this did is it effectively provided a depth of field preview, as I'll show you here. So there's the apertures closed down, and then that would be in manual mode, and then that's opened up, and that's automatic mode. Now, you would want to use this lens on this camera in the A mode when composing and focusing, and notice how there are no focusing aids. The image just pops when it comes into focus. The A mode holds the aperture open all the way to allow the greatest amount of light into the camera. Switching to M lets the lens step down to whatever f-stop you're using so you can see your depth of field. However, that wasn't exactly how this feature was intended. If I take this lens off, you'll see that there's a pin on the bottom of this lens, and it lines up with this plate. The plate would move forward to press in this pin, so the lens would be at the proper f-stop when the photo was taken. Allow me to demonstrate. I'll do that one more time. Some older cameras didn't have this plate, so to make the lenses compatible with these older cameras, there was a manual setting that the photographer would switch to before taking the photograph. This feature was considered automatic because now the photographer didn't have to do that themselves. Now, moving to the top of this camera, we notice that there's an ASA dial around the film winder. ASA was a unit of measuring film sensitivity to light before ISO, but they share the same scale. This didn't actually do anything. It was just a reminder for the photographer to know what kind of film and what speed of film was loaded. You might use the white portion of the dial for black and white film, and the red dial perhaps for tungsten color balance film, for example. This was important because many months could pass before a roll of film was used up, and this was a useful reminder for selecting the proper aperture and shutter speed. Now, moving over, we have the shutter speed dial that goes from bulb all the way up to 1/500th of a second. and you would align it up with this line here. In reality, this camera will shoot at 1/1000th of a second by simply turning it one click further. Now, next to that, we'll find the film winder, which integrates a film frame counter right up here in this window. Now, next to that is our shutter release button. This is threaded, so you could use accessories like a remote shutter release or a self-timer like this cherry. So let's see how that would work. So this is what the self-timer would look like. It's made in Japan. I'm going to go ahead and wind it and see if I remember how to do this. So now our self-timer is set and wound, and then you would wind your film, and then you could do this the other way around, I suppose. You could thread this in first and then advance the film. But now this is ready to go. Let's watch. See? Now you know that the lack of a self-timer and a shutter speed dial that stops at 1/500th of a second did not limit the S1a at all. In fact, I think I preferred the timer like the cherry, as it provides a greater visual aid to the photographer taking a selfie. Now, I'm going to show you how to open the back of this camera to load a roll of film. First, I'll remove the protective cover on the bottom, which unscrews from the tripod mount. Notice how this has a threaded hole so that you could attach accessories while leaving this case on. So that was a pretty good idea. So now that this is off, let's open it up. There's a slider at the side here that must be used to open the back. And it works like this. You slide this down and then the back pops open. You can still lift the film rewind knob, but that doesn't actually open the camera. That's just to get the can of film and then it moves this pin out of the way. We'll wind it, click it, and then when you're at the last roll, when you do want to wind up your film, there's a button here on the bottom with the letter R, so you would hold that in while you wound the film back. So that's it. That's my video demonstrating the Pentax S1a. In my opinion, this is one of the more underrated cameras of today, as it can hold its own against any modern camera. The only drawback is that it uses the M42 mount, but there are plenty of M42 mount lenses still available today because they were meant to last. If you're interested in film photography and come across one of these beauties, I say go ahead and get it if the price is right. Thank you for watching.